So I'm delighted to be with you all. As Victoria mentioned, first of all, I wish Victoria a speedy, healthy recovery. Yes, I think even though things are really very grim here in the Middle East, in Israel, Palestine, in a sense, I think that there's something very important in us connecting this evening, because I think one of the important messages from the movement for compassion amongst animals and towards a plant-based diet is not only that of our inextricable interconnectedness, but also of the fact that compassion should not be reserved for any one exclusive segment of our world. The more compassion we can show to the broader cross-section within human society and beyond, the more we contribute to a better world. And compassion should not be something that is exclusively held, nor to one community, nor even to one species. And therefore, I think that coming together to express universal, unlimited, expansive compassion is really important, especially at such times of suffering and pain and threat. So I've been asked to speak about Judaism and veganism, which I'm delighted to do. For me, it's obviously a very important topic as an Orthodox rabbi, as a committed Jew, and at the same time, a committed vegan. I would start off by pointing to the fact that the ideal society portrayed within the Bible is a vegan society. If you go to the story of the creation, which coincidentally, we within the Jewish world started reading that passage, the beginning of Genesis, this Sabbath, in other words, just a few hours ago, as for Lisa here, tells of the creation story in which the Garden of Eden is a vegan context. Even Adam are told that of all the fruits and vegetables of the garden they are to partake of, they are only therefore given a plant-based diet. What happens in terms of the biblical story is that humanity shows that it has difficulty maintaining a high moral standard. It degenerates in many different areas. This leads also to a degeneration, not only in human relations, but also in relations between humanity and the natural world, the animal world. And as a result, when after the flood, that is the culmination of this degeneration, the Noah and his children are permitted to consume animal flesh under certain restrictions and limitations. And indeed, I'll come back to the whole idea of the limitations on meat eating as a theme within the biblical text, within especially the Pentateuch, the Torah, the text which according to Jewish tradition is the revelation of Mount Sinai. But the ideal society in Garden of Eden is a plant-based society, a society where the human diet is a plant-based diet. Also, if we take literally, as certainly many within Jewish tradition did, the vision of the prophets of the Messianic age, the vision of the prophet Isaiah is one in which the wolf and the lamb, the lion and the kid lie down together. In other words, where there is no destruction, you shall do no harm, and no destruction within my holy mountain. In other words, it is also a society where there is no wanton destruction, let alone, God forbid, any killing. So this is clearly the biblical ideal. As I indicated, it is also clear that the Bible mandates for a certain consumption of animal flesh and products, but it is also clear that this is not seen as an ideal. In fact, the biblical language, when allowing the consumption of such animal products, is im ta'aveh nafshotechem lechol basar, if your hearts lust to eat meat. So this is clearly the language of concession. Lust isn't a positive concept. In other words, the biblical revelation takes into account not only the sociological context, but also human frailty, and therefore seeks to wean humanity away from its more base inclinations and practices to a higher level. This is also, of course, Maimonides' understanding of the nature of sacrifices, the offerings that would existed within a temple. And in fact, this is an idea that goes back 2,000 years ago to sources within the Midrash, which is that this was the way people expressed devotion and religious service, and therefore there was a process that was seeking to wean them away from the most bestial forms of expressing these ideas. And indeed, the sages of the Talmud 2,000 years ago precisely describe the purpose of all the laws within the Torah, within the Hebrew Bible, concerning keeping kosher, the dietary laws with what kind of animals you can consume, and the conditions under which they have to be slaughtered, and the conditions under which their products can be eaten, as all means of directing humanity towards a refinement of the human spirit. And for many great rabbis, perhaps most recently Rabbi J.B. Soloveitchik is well known in America, Rabbi Abraham Isaac Cohen Cook in the Holy Land, but going back into the Middle Ages, many rabbis pointed out that the whole area of the kosher laws is designed to wean people away from meat eating and animal consumption towards a better both, above all, morally better diet, to raise, therefore, the human spirit. And indeed, one may well argue, I think legitimately argue, that there were many times and places within Jewish history where it was very difficult to get a fully healthy, well-balanced diet from vegetative sources, which is no longer the case. And therefore, I think it's very important to argue that today, with the ability to be able to obtain all necessary nutrients from plant-based sources, it's very difficult to justify even the principle of animal product consumption, let alone the practice. And I'll come to the practice in a moment. But there are many aspects today which are very contrary to this particular vision of ennobling the spirit, with regards to the consumption of animal products and the production and their availability on the market. One of the most important teachings with regards to Judaism is that we have a responsibility to take care of our home. We have responsibility towards one another. We have responsibility to the human family. We have responsibility to the garden. In other words, in the story of the Garden of Eden, humanity is placed in the garden to develop it and to protect it. And I'm now translating directly from the Hebrew. This is what we would call today sustainable development. And we have today a situation of where the whole livestock industry, as has been mentioned, and as you all know well, is the major source of destruction of our environment. It's the major source of pollution. It is a major source of wastage of our resources, our water resources, our land resources. The destruction of the rainforest is posing a threat, of course, to the indigenous communities, but it's posing a threat to our whole ecosystem as a whole. All the studies, and these are well-known United Nations studies, many other resources have shown that were we to move to a plant-based diet, we could actually save our planet from the threat of global warming that we're facing at the moment, and we will be able to restore an equilibrium that would enable us to guarantee that this planet is healthy for future generations. It seems to me that for anybody who takes biblical sources seriously, and I would say every observant Jew, believing Jew, should be taking these biblical resources seriously, and of course not just Jews, then the instruction to be able to develop and preserve the garden, in other words, our home, becomes an imperative for a plant-based diet within the contemporary context. It's very difficult to justify how one can be party to such massive degradation of our environment that comes through the animal product production, and especially through through factory farming of animals today. In addition to the destruction of the environment, there's the whole question of distributive justice. We know, as a famous saying goes, attributed to various great persons, there is enough food for humanity's need, but not enough food for humanity's greed. Were we to adopt a more modest lifestyle, and certainly a more compassionate lifestyle, we would have the resources to be able to ensure that the scandal of millions dying of hunger on a regular basis could be obviated, and we'd be able to provide for a much healthier world at large. In addition to these concerns, there are precepts within Jewish teaching which today are categorically violated in the animal production industry, in animal farming, and the conditions in which animals are kept, let alone the process in which they are slaughtered and provided for the human market. The most obvious of these is the area of cruelty. Now, it's true, as we have said, that the Bible does allow for the consumption of animal products, but it allows under very restrictive conditions, as I've mentioned. The laws of keeping kosher, even if one does not share the opinion that their purpose is to refine the human spirit, nevertheless very clearly lay down very strict conditions. And the conditions also relate to the whole question of cruelty to animals. To us, it may sound a little bit paradoxical, but even though there is obviously cruelty in any kind of animal slaughter, nevertheless, Jewish law lays down restrictions at what is considered to be gratuitous cruelty. In other words, anything that causes unnecessary suffering, in quotation marks, is considered to be a violation of the prohibition against causing suffering to animals, which is a biblical prohibition according to Jewish tradition. Today, the livestock industry, and especially animal livestock factory farming, involves far more cruelty than anything in our past. It's a paradox that in a modern civilization, the instruments for satisfying human greed are far more barbaric than those that were functioning in our great-grandparents' age, let alone generations beforehand. In the past, the slaughter of animals, at least if it doesn't sound too obscene, was a personal engagement with the animal. Today, the mass destruction of animals, massive scale and massive process, might often be done in a manner that may be perceived to be more aesthetic, but is not more compassionate. I can attest to that, having visited slaughterhouses and seen how the need to be able to meet the demand process them through an assembly line where the rapidity with which the animals are passed through means that what are meant to be more compassionate means of stunning the animals are often very ineffective. And the cruelty and the distress that the animals are in is very patent. This is done on such a massive scale that it is really quite shocking to see the way humanity has degenerated in its whole relationship towards the animal world. And this unquestionably desecrates the Jewish teaching that seeks to limit the distress to animals in order to be able to provide for human need. And as I said earlier, human need today cannot justify anyway the slaughter of animals when we can have our nutrients and all our necessary resources available for our well-being today, at least for the vast majority of humanity. Another very important Jewish principle is the principle against wastage. This is called in Hebrew bal tashchit. It's based upon the text in Deuteronomy that instructs the children of Israel when in a war of self-defense not to cut down fruit trees to use for military defenses, let alone assault weapons. And the rabbis use what we would call an a fortiori deduction. If you cannot destroy such natural resources, even for legitimate self-defense, how much more so under normal circumstances? The result is that for 2,000 years, Judaism has had a whole corpus of legal restrictions that anything that causes wastage and anything that causes pollution, so that, for example, if you had a tannery or anything that causes smoke, there were restrictions on where you could place it. It had to be outside so that it wouldn't cause problems to people's well-being. And the result of that, and as well as the environmental wastage or the environmental pollution, there were restrictions upon personal consumption, so that overindulgence was seen as a form of wastage. Overindulgence, overspending on material things, but certainly food wastage was seen as sinful. And the need to be able to appreciate resources was considered a value. As we mentioned earlier, today, in order to be able to provide for the needs of the mass destruction, mass slaughter of animals, resources are wasted on an unimaginable scale. We have enough water and natural land to be able to feed our world, but this is recklessly wasted in the way it is used to be able to provide for this human indulgence in animal flesh and animal products. And of course, as has already been mentioned, a very important thing is also the Jewish teaching, all of this based with unbiblical sources, of the need to protect your own health and the health of society. Today, the amount of hormones and antibiotics pumped into animals, because on the scale of the production, there would be so much disease that would wipe out all the numbers of these animals being caged and being kept in such restrictive conditions, are retained within the flesh that are consumed by human beings. And there is enormous correlation between meat consumption and various cancers, as well as, of course, heart disease and so many other afflictions. And we are obliged, according to Jewish understanding of the biblical text that says in Deuteronomy, "And you shall take great care of your souls," to be able to protect our health. Therefore, consuming anything that is destructive of one's health is considered to be sinful, and therefore is another reason for avoiding the consumption of these products that are saturated with destructive components in terms of human health. And this, of course, has very often a much more impactful influence within Jewish communities. Very often, especially within my own community, within Jewish Orthodoxy, there is often a suspicion against, if you like, what are very often seen as faddish innovations or new means and new, like, moral suggestions that were not the practice of generations before. Religions tend to be almost by definition rather conservative organizations, and the more deeply rooted a segment of religion is, very often the more suspicious it tends to be of outside ideas that have not come from its own particular community. Therefore, when you talk in terms of both the broader environmental and health aspects, and even wastage, this very often doesn't have the impact that one would hope it would have. But when one speaks directly to people about the impact of health, the impact of meat consumption on their health, then, and therefore on the health of their children, and the environmental consequences on their immediate context, then very often it has a significant impact. And I think we see this in many areas within the Jewish community today. There is an increasing move towards vegetarianism and towards veganism, towards a plant-based diet. And I think the major impetus is coming within certainly the religiously observant community from health concerns. All these factors mean that when we talk in terms today of keeping kosher within the Jewish community, it is very difficult to be able to argue that meat consumption and animal products on the market can truly be in consonance with the ideals of keeping a kosher way of life, which, according to the Bible, according to the Torah, is meant to induce holiness. Holiness is meant to be God consciousness. It's meant to be raising a greater awareness, greater mindfulness. And of course, if we are party to this mass destruction and to this barbarism, then it is diminishing our holiness, diminishing our spiritual awareness, diminishing our mindfulness, and not contributing to it. So it seems to me today that it is very difficult to be able to legitimately argue for a continuation of animal product consumption, especially at a time when such alternative resources are available to us. There are so many other issues that relate to both economics and financial concerns. There are many reasons why there is resistance within certainly the observant Jewish community to these ideas, which on the face of it should be so compelling that there should be no resistance. But very often, as I've said, because of past practices, this is not always the case. But we also see very interesting developments taking place in the non-observant community within the Jewish society, especially here in Israel, where many of you know that Israel has become one of the leaders in terms of vegan trends. And I think a lot of that has to do precisely with a search for an outlet for spirituality within the difficulties of the conflict in which we find ourselves, right? But I think it's nevertheless a very inspiring development. I think it's an increasing development which holds much promise for the future. I'm very happy to take up upon any of these issues. And because there's so much in each and every dimension that I've raised, I think I'm going to radically restrict my monologue now and open it up for greater discussion with Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Rosen. That was so inspiring. I want to listen many more times. So who would like to start off the Q&A section? Was that a hand, Debbie? Yes, Debbie?
Hi. So thank you so much for being here, and especially with everything that's going on right now. I guess sometimes what is questioned, it was interesting, like how you brought up like Deuteronomy and different biblical sections. I get back people saying to me, like, God said, we have dominion. So do you want to maybe go over something like that, or maybe just in general, like when people kind of shoot back at you, can you help me out with that, please?
Absolutely. No, I think it's really great that you bring up specific texts, and I really would like to address all these particular texts, and that's one of the most important ones to address. Those who are trying to base their resistance to a plant-based diet on the very idea that dominion should mean in some way exploitation, which of course is nonsense. The very fact that restrictions are placed on human behavior shows that humanity does not have a mandate simply because it has power to do everything that it can. Not everything that is possible is desirable. Not everything that people are capable of is moral. And the idea Rabbi Kook, this great Jewish thinker of the 20th century who I referred to before, specifically addresses this question of dominion. And he says, dominion means, of course, behaving responsibly towards your subjects. A king who has dominion is only a righteous king if the king cares for the well-being of those whom he has responsibility for. Otherwise, he's an evil king and his actions are condemnable. So our responsibility, precisely because we have been gifted with divine intelligence and capacity for moral choice, is to behave morally towards those whom we have power over. Power doesn't necessarily mean exploitation. In fact, it shouldn't mean exploitation. It shouldn't mean behavior towards those whom one has potential control over in a manner that causes pain and suffering to them. On the contrary, if you have real dominion, then you have real responsibility for greater compassion, care for the well-being of creatures and of our ecosystem.
Yes. Let's tell that to those people. Okay. Next question. You can either write it in the chat or just raise your electronic hand and we'll call on you. Louise.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Victoria, for extending the invitation to your former students. And thank you, Rabbi, for being here today. I really appreciate it. I guess my question is, I heard you say how, being kosher, you should not be inflicting additional pain or suffering. So how do we talk to people who celebrate Kippuris with chickens instead of coins? What would be the best?
Okay, so for those who are not familiar with it, there are practice. So all religions have, if you like, what is their core and what are adhesions of various kinds. And to be more specific, in the Jewish tradition, there are commandments, there are precepts, to be more precise, that are part of the Jewish way of life. And then there are customs. Not all customs are actually good customs. There are customs that have come out of certain superstitions and ideas, and I could point to a number of them. I would describe this idea of symbolizing the atonement for your sins on the eve of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, by transferring them onto a chicken as superstitious. However, it is certainly not an obligation in terms of Jewish law. It's only a custom. And therefore, it was a custom that was actually condemned by many great Jewish authorities precisely because it was causing unnecessary suffering to animals. In fact, the Code of Jewish Law, the Shulchan Aruch, written by Rabbi Joseph Caro some 600 years ago, specifically condemns the practice as contradictory to Jewish teaching with regards to compassion animals. It can't be justified. Killing the animal for the needs of humanity that were needed, the sustenance coming from animal sources when perhaps, as I said earlier, they didn't have other resources available to them, still has to be done under very limited conditions. Simply to do it as a means of trying to transfer your sense of guilt onto another creature is not something that is considered to be necessary, let alone desirable. But nevertheless, this practice is still quite common. As you said correctly, what many rabbis advocated, especially those that were opposed to this folk custom, which is a more correct way to describe it, was to be able to use money and to wave money over their heads rather than the fowl. And most, I would say, responsible rabbinic authorities today within the Orthodox world, because this is almost only practiced within the Orthodox world, advocate using money. I think that if you wish to be able, however, to bring an end to this practice, the people who indulge in this practice are not going to be persuaded by the arguments we have been using. Therefore, you've got to use their own particular language. This is always the important area. I didn't get into this in too much detail in my initial presentation, but when you're dealing with Orthodox Jews, especially ultra-Orthodox Jews, who are involved in such practices, you have to argue with them in terms of the issues that they care about most. And with regards to the animals, both not only in this particular practice, but generally, the most important thing is to be able to argue regarding the technical kosher criteria that these people are meticulous about. So let me give you now here an example, not from the one you're asking about, but there is a great scholar in New York who is one of the leaders of Yeshiva University, who was informed that the conditions under which dairy cows are maintained are so inhumane that they are distorting the inner organs of the animals. He actually went and did research and checked up upon these dairy cows, which when their inner organs were checked, were actually so distorted that it would have rendered the cow non-kosher for consumption. And the principle within Jewish practice is that something that comes from a non-kosher animal is not kosher. And therefore, he came to the conclusion that most dairy production that was available within the New York area was not kosher milk, because the animals that were producing it had been so distorted by the way they were fed and the conditions they were under that the animals' inner organs were no longer if you like, healthy. And this then renders them non-kosher. When you speak to people about how the condition under which animals are maintained today distorts their inner organs and makes them therefore not fit for consumption, they suddenly get rather nervous about whether they are observing the technicalities of kosher observance properly. In other words, it's not got to do with the moral principles that we've been discussing. It's got to do with the technicalities. The same thing applies to the birds, to use with regards to kaparot or kaporas, this particular practice. When they're slaughtered, after they've been slaughtered, they are consumed. However, if you have actually treated them, mistreated in this manner, there are various fractures or various wounds that are inflicted upon the animals as a result of it that actually render them very problematic in terms of keeping kosher. So this argument very often works much better amongst the ultra-Orthodox than an argument of moral principle, unfortunately. But it's useful for us in terms of our understanding that this behavior does violate the moral principles, and therefore we have to find the necessary means in order to bring it to an end. I'm very happy to say today, already now for maybe over the last 20 years and increasingly in the last few years, there have been scores of rabbinic statements and declarations that have been issued condemning this practice and telling people not to do it. And if they want to go through this particular folk ritual, to use money rather than to use the animal.
Thank you. Unfortunately, it's still rather prevalent here in Brooklyn, but thank you very much.
Rachel.
Yes, thank you, Victoria. And thank you, Rabbi. I'm just an honor to be able to address you here personally. And you've talked very eloquently and quickly about Jews that are non-vegan and bringing Pesukim about how they can become vegan. But what about the Jew who is already vegan and we're just surrounded by ritual items, the Torah itself, that are made from animals? How can we reconcile with that? I mean, it's everywhere. It's in our homes, the shuls, it's everywhere.
Indeed. But you should be very reassured to know that for Torah scrolls, or for the mezuzah parchments, or for the tefillin, for the phylacteries, there is no need to slaughter an animal. It just has, these items just have to be made from the leather of a kosher animal. In fact, in an ideal world, this is very healthy recycling and avoidance of wastage. We should be able to have the skins of all animals that have died naturally to be able to provide for these things. There should be no need to kill in order to provide for these ritual items. Today, we go actually at a situation of where, thanks to modern technology, I think we are fast approaching a situation where these atrocities of various kinds are going to come to an end, both for economic factors and for other factors that we've referred to. So we can see how now cultured meat is emerging for those who still have a desire to have this particular taste on their palate. There are now increasingly alternative sources, and there will be more and more alternative sources. This will also mean that there will be alternative ways of producing these various ritual items without needing to slaughter animals. So I think the news is really good for the future as we move away from these undesirable practices.
Thank you. Thank you.
And there was another question in the chat, but it was the same question. So that was a popular question. Somebody else? I see people moving their hands. Either raise your electronic hand or just speak up.
Yeah, 10 minutes on the clock. It's your chance to get it.
Well, I'm going to ask one then, since nobody else is. Rabbi Rosen, you have said many times in this short time we've been together, a positivity about the future. And particularly given what is going on in Israel and Palestine right now, I'm just blown away that you can see a positive future. So can you help us understand first how you see it, what's going on there from being close, and then also how you manage to be positive?
Well, I mean, the present situation is an awful situation, and I'm happy to talk a little bit more about it if you want me to. But let's talk of the big picture. In terms of the big picture, we all know the difference between the optimist and the pessimist. But why does the optimist see the glass half full, and why does the pessimist see it as half empty? The pessimist is the unrealistic one, that he expects the glass to be completely full. And as he looks down, he sees everything that's missing and he becomes disappointed. The optimist is the one who is being a little more realistic, because she comes from underneath and she knows that the glass was originally empty, and therefore she can see every drop that's in it and celebrate it. So within human history, for every 2 steps forward, there's 1 step back, and in every particular condition, there can be very tragic steps back. I think particularly as a Jew, when I think that only 2 generations ago, we were in a situation of where there was the most horrendous genocide of Jews ever in human history. And we see where we've come to, that even though we've just undergone one of the most traumatic events probably in the history of Israel, with the murder of over 1,000 people, and now we have hostages, old people, babes, men, women, and children taken, and we don't know what's going to happen in terms of their fate. We do have a state, and we do have apparatus to be able to defend ourselves, and we do have the capacity to be able to protect ourselves, something which we didn't have 2 generations ago. And for all the trauma of the situation we're in, we are in a far better situation than we were in the past. And throughout Jewish history, we were completely vulnerable to the whims and the fancies of anyone around us, and generally not very nice or very compassionate towards us. And we've still been able to survive all that and still be able to survive today. So there's a great deal, even in this terrible time, to be grateful for. And I think within our world as a whole, even though terrible things are happening in many places, in Ukraine, in Myanmar, there's oppression taking place for various minorities and communities in different places. And of course, Palestinians here have been suffering and continue to suffer at the hands of various forces, not least of all the tragedy of their own leadership, but nevertheless, suffering doesn't make any difference. No suffering is less suffering simply because you can explain it in terms of its political factors any more simply. So all this suffering should cause us great distress. But in fact, in terms of human history, there is far less suffering today in our world at large, far more enlightenment than there was, the capacity to be able to address things, international institutions which may have serious limitations and flaws, but they are there for the first time. So while, as I say, this situation and many others is a source of great distress, we must not lose appreciation for those drops of water that have created the glass that is half full, and not lose hope that we can increase these and continue to increase our own compassion, our own respect for human dignity, for the dignity of all life, as our own particular contribution to making a world a better place. It may seem very insignificant and very small, but all these different drops together make up the half glass. They make up tributaries, they make up streams, they make up rivers, they make up seas, and eventually those seas will become the dominant resource, a source of health and healing for humanity at large.
Thank you so much. And there is a comment, Debbie is saying that is an incredible outlook, and I so appreciate your words of hope and truth. Does somebody have a question? If not, I am going to ask if the rabbi would kindly expand a little bit, that you said you would talk about how you see the situation there. We're all so far away, so all we know are headlines and CNN.
So the trauma, you know, first of all, we are all here traumatized. And we see our situations obviously in very different paradigms, and everybody here sees themselves as a victim, and we just see ourselves in different settings. So the Palestinians see themselves as the victims of Israeli military power. Israel sees itself as a target, a victim of hatred, both from within the Palestinian population and from Arab countries around it. The Arab world sees itself as a victim of Western exploitation, imperialism, colonialism, consumerism, etc. Everybody feels that if something's wrong, it's somebody else's fault. And it's very difficult when you are in a state of trauma to be able to look at yourself honestly in the mirror. And at the moment, this trauma has been increased to such a degree that there are very few voices, both within Israeli and Palestinian society, that have even any inclination, let alone capacity, to be able to understand the suffering of the other community. And this, unfortunately, is going to lead to a process, already has led, and will continue to lead to a process of retaliation and counter-retaliation. For most of us, it looks overwhelmingly bleak. But I think that what is hopeful at this particular stage is precisely what I've been referring to in different contexts in the course of this last hour, and that is the interconnectedness of us all. And this means that in this part of the world, the various regimes, and I would say even globally, cannot afford to allow this situation to continue to fester. And therefore, I think after this enormous and continuing enormous tragedy, I think, and I hope, and I pray that there will be greater international involvement. I hope that this may lead to collaborative, concerted effort between Arab countries as well as the United States and Israel and Europe to be able to move towards some kind of conference and collaboration that would bring a resolution to the Palestinian problem. Above all, I think that the only way Hamas will be defeated will not be through Israeli military action, even though most Israelis believe that that is the way. I think time has shown that that will not prove to be a final resolution of the situation, but will only be through bringing in some kind of international force, which I hope will be a collaborative event. That such a situation could bring an end to the rule of Hamas, allow Palestinian Authority under new leadership to establish itself there, and hopefully move towards a resolution. You might say, why would the Arab countries of the region be interested in that? And I would say, in many respects, precisely for the reason that those countries that signed the Abraham Accords did so, and for the same reason that Saudi Arabia is trying to move towards reconciliation with Israel, which this latest violence has probably stymied, at least in terms of the immediate horizon. And that is because they fear, and many of them are of the opinion, I think probably with justification, that the strings of this terrible assault by Hamas have been pulled in no small measure by Iran, and that Iran has an interest in destabilizing the situation and exploiting this particular conflict. And those Arab countries, those Sunni Arab countries, both are signatories to the Abraham Accords and those who would like to move in that particular direction, feel more threatened by Iran, perhaps even than Israel. And therefore, in order to be able to bring this destabilization to an end, I think they have a strategic interest in resolving this particular conflict. So even though it sounds almost obscene for those families that have lost dear ones, those who are at the moment burying their dead, those who are suffering the uncertainty of whether members of their families who've been taken hostage, parents, children, members of their family are still alive or not. Why, it would seem almost obscene to be able to say it. Nevertheless, I believe that some sweetness may come from the bitter. Something positive may come out of this particular tragedy that will enable us to reconstruct the political fabric in this region in a manner that will lead to a more productive future. That is my prayer.
Thank you so much.